Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar about optimum incubation at high altitude. My name is Gerd de Lange and I'm a Senior Poultry Specialist at Royal Pas Reform. It is great to be speaking with all of you today. Before we start, I have a few housekeeping items to cover. First of all, there will be a few polls during this presentation, and you are invited to give your answer on these polls within the few seconds that I will give you for that. Secondly, you have the opportunity to ask questions in the chat function of this webinar platform, and we will try as much as we can during the webinar to answer your questions. And last but not least, at the end of this presentation, you will receive an email in your inbox with a webinar replay as well as the handout. So let's get started. After a short introduction, I will explain to you what is different at high altitude and how this could affect incubation results. We will also see that embryos as well as parent stock can adapt themselves to a certain extent to the altitude on which the eggs need to be incubated. And finally, most important part of this presentation, what can the hatchery manager do at high altitude to still get good hatch results? We do have hatcheries at various parts in the world at high altitude. A few examples I can mention here. For example, in the southern part of Africa, Namibia, Windhoek, we have a hatchery at 1600 meters from sea level. Also in the northeast of Africa, Ethiopia, we see that hatcheries are located at a quite high altitude. Another example, Latin America, for example, Aguas Calientes, hatcheries are there at 1800 meters from sea level. And finally, also we do have customers in Eastern Europe, for example, Armenia or Kyrgyzstan, where hatcheries can be found at 1500 meters from sea level. Just like any other hatcheries, these hatcheries would like to get good hatch results. And that means good chick quality and high hatchability. Now, what do we need in general at sea level as well as on altitude to get these good hatch results? First of all, we need a good quality hatching egg. Secondly, we need to give the embryos and the eggs optimal incubation conditions, and we have to provide good management which is based on knowledge and experience. And this brings me to the first poll. We have seen in the previous slide that we need good quality hatching eggs. And the question that I would like to ask is, does altitude affect the egg itself? What do you think? So the poll is true or false. Hatching eggs produced at sea level are similar to hatching eggs produced at 1500 to 2000 meters. Please think for a while and let me know true or false. Incubation management supports the different phases of embryonic and extra embryonic tissue development during the differentiation phase, the growth phase and the maturation phase. And this of course is not only true for hatcheries at sea level, but also for hatcheries at high altitude. And the important question that we need to answer is there any need to make changes to the set points for temperature, humidity, ventilation or for turning when we are incubating eggs at a high altitude? This brings me to the next poll, and I would like to know if you agree or disagree to the next statement. Incubation at 1500 meters to 2000 meters from sea level poses some challenges in achieving optimal results. Think for a while and let me know if you agree or disagree. Let's discuss what is different at high altitude. There are quite some differences. First of all, the air pressure is lower at high altitude, and there is a lower oxygen availability. Gases are diffusing easier through the eggshell, and at altitude the air is colder and contains less water. As we can see in this slide, the higher you go, the lower the air pressure. And also, what we can see in this slide, in this figure that is derived from an AviaGen publication, is that the higher you go, and especially when you go over 2000 meters, hatch results are getting lower and lower. Now, why? Lower air pressure. Yes, but we see here that in all the situations, no matter if you are at sea level or at 2000 meter altitude, the oxygen concentration is the same. It's 21% in all situations. So what explains this problem with lower air pressure? Well, what you can see in the figure is how the oxygen that is in the air is passing through the eggshell by diffusion into the blood vessel system, such that the oxygenated blood can be transported to the embryo. And in the same way, CO2 is diffusing out of the egg. Now, when we go to a lower air pressure, to a higher altitude, and we get a lower air pressure, it actually means that there is more space between the molecules in 1 cubic meter of air. You see, when you see at sea level, this cubic meter that is demonstrating the sea level situation, you see that the molecules there are quite close together. And at high altitude, in the same cubic meter, there are plenty less molecules. So there's also plenty less oxygen. And actually, this means that the partial pressure of oxygen is lower. And I can tell you from my own experience, recently I was visiting the hatchery in Namibia, and as I travel, I normally take my running shoes along, and I started to run, and after 200 meters, I already was completely short of breath. And then I realized, oh yes, I'm at altitude. 3 days later, when I was there for at least 3 times 24 hours, my body started to adapt a little bit, and I managed, even though it was with difficulties, to run a 5 kilometer. So indeed, at altitude, there is less oxygen available. That's the negative aspect. The positive effect of that is that the diffusion rate through the pores is easier. There is a higher diffusion rate. I will try to explain that by a cross-section of an eggshell. What you actually see here is an eggshell, and I'm focusing on the pore of the eggshell. You see the red oxygen molecules on their way in through the pore are meeting up with less nitrogen molecules. So on their way in through the shell, there are less collisions, less bumping into other molecules, which makes it that the oxygen can more easily travel through the shell to the bloodstream. In the same way, also CO2 is diffusing easier out of the egg, which is not that relevant probably, but what we should also realize is that water can escape more easily from the shell, from the egg through the shell into the environment. So there is a higher egg weight loss when eggs are being incubated at altitude. Another difference between sea level and altitude is that the temperature is decreasing. And the temperature decrease is roughly 6.5 centigrades for every 1000 meters you are going up. And this actually means not only that the outside air is colder, but also drier. If you compare sea level situation, 25 centigrades, 50% relative humidity, you see that there is 9.9 grams of water in a kilogram of air. And if I go to 2000 meters and I maintain the same temperature and humidity, 25 centigrades, 50% relative humidity, you see that for that I need to add more water to the same kilogram of air, 12.6 grams of water per kilogram of air. So to make that same climate at altitude, more water needs to be added to the air. If you make a correction for the air density, you see in both cases it's the same. It's 11.6 grams of water per cubic meter of air. But this is not realistic. I just said on the previous slide that the temperature at altitude is lower, 6.5 centigrades per 1000 meters. So in this case, 13 degrees less than 25 degrees, which is 12 degrees. And when I have the same relative humidity of 50%, I only have 5.5 grams of water per kilogram air. So that air is actually much, much drier. And if I want to bring it to the same 9.9 grams of water per kilogram air, so to the same kind of situation, I have to raise my relative humidity to 87%. In summary, the hatch results at altitude are mostly affected by the fact that there is less oxygen available for the developing embryos, and secondly, because the eggs are dehydrating at a faster rate. Now, as mentioned in the introduction already, embryos as well as parent stock can to a certain extent adapt themselves to this high altitude. And the way the embryos are adapting themselves to the less availability, the low availability of oxygen, as mentioned already, the diffusion rate through the shell is higher, so even though there is less oxygen available, it passes more easily through the shell. That's not really an adaptation of the embryo itself, but the adaptation of the embryo itself is that it has a higher level of hemoglobin in the bloodstream, and with that it can bind the oxygen much more efficiently, and at the same time there is also a more promoted unloading of the oxygen from the hemoglobin in the blood to the tissues of the embryo. And remember the poll we did a while ago? Indeed, we can see that birds producing eggs at altitude, they are making the shell with a lower effective pore area to avoid that eggs at altitude have a high rate of dehydration. So this is an adaptation of the parent stock producing eggs at altitude. Of course, eggs from sea level are not adapted to be incubated at altitude, and they have a more open pore structure, so eggs at altitude, eggs produced at sea level, have a higher risk at altitude to get dehydrated. Now, what can we do by hatchery management at high altitude to get still the best possible results? Do we need to make changes to the temperature, the relative humidity, the ventilation rate, or turning when we want to incubate eggs at altitude? Well, how are we dealing with the fact that there is less oxygen available at altitude? Theoretically, it is possible to inject oxygen into the setters and into the hatches to bring the oxygen level from 21% to 23 or even 25% to compensate for the lower availability of oxygen. But this is very expensive, and also it is increasing the fire risk inside these hatcheries. And I do not know personally any hatcheries who are doing so. What we know hatcheries do is they focus a lot on getting as much as possible air through their setters and through their hatches. So first of all, there should be any recirculation. We do not want to use used air with a higher CO2 level to pass through the machines. We only want to ventilate our setters and hatches with fresh air. And to make sure that we get sufficient air through the machine, it's very important to ensure that the air pressures on the inlet and the outlet of the setters and the hatches are meeting the requirements, such that the air can easily go in and easily go out of the machines. Knowing that there is less oxygen available at altitude, we should be very careful that the embryos are getting too warm, because when the embryo metabolism is pushed by high temperature to a level where the oxygen becomes the limiting factor, they will die. So we should be very careful with our set point temperature. Even though there is no real need to incubate with lower temperature set points at sea level as compared to altitude. But we have to make sure that we avoid overheating. And if embryos are getting too hot, then in that case we could consider to reduce the set point temperature a bit. Another issue related to ventilation, many setters and hatches nowadays are ventilating based on CO2 set points. We have to realize the sensor that we use to measure the CO2 level inside setter and hatcher, is that CO2 sensor calibrated for sea level or not? Because most sensors are calibrated for sea level. So in case you are using that sensor at altitude, you have to make a correction in your mind that you work with lower CO2 set points such that you have the same kind of ventilation rate as on sea level. So you can see here, for example, at 2000 meter, Past Reform is not advising 0.4% as a set point for a setter, but 0.3%, and this is just to compensate for the calibration of the CO2 sensor for sea level. Then how are we dealing with the fact that eggs, especially sea level eggs, have a higher risk of dehydrating or getting dehydrated when incubated at altitude? Basically what we have to do is to raise the relative humidity inside the setter to a higher level. And we have to make sure that the outside air, which is normally colder and drier, that we bring it to a good temperature and a good water content to avoid that we get really low relative humidity inside our setters. What you can see in the graph, the blue line is showing the level, the the humidity profile that we advise for hatcheries at altitude. On average, the relative humidity is higher, and in the beginning of the setter period, we try, when the embryo does not need so much ventilation yet, to conserve humidity, such that by the end of the incubation period, the last, let's say, 5 days, we can increase the ventilation rate and accept that the humidity inside the setter is getting a little bit lower. But still, on average, we are working with a higher relative humidity. Basically, this is how we can deal with incubation at high altitude. As said before, you are going to receive the webinar replay and the handout in your email pretty soon after this webinar. And please do take time to visit our knowledge section at our website to see if there is anything more of your interest there. See you at our next webinar. Thank you.
Royal Past Reform for the highest number of best quality chicks.